Okay, so now we're recording. Thank you everyone for joining the Mind Sharpener now in its virtual form. And thank you for joining this effort from Ideas blog and from Davide and from Laura. So we are now starting with this new format of things because of the circumstances, as you know. And we are moving most of our activities online, and so we're doing projects that don't necessarily need a physical space. And therefore, we make this announcement. This is like a big announcement that our physical space is now shut. You know, we are closing this definitely, well, indefinitely for now. But we still develop projects and activities like this away from the physical space. So, you know, things don't stop, but well, this is kind of like the new way of doing things, and we encourage everyone anyway to shoot us emails or ideas whenever you have them. I mean, we are running this organization, so things keep on happening even if there's no physical space. That was like just very quickly the big announcement.
Yeah, and hopefully we can do more online events. So, you know, we also write us if you have some ideas for something to happen online.
Yes, projects, etc. And so that's it. With no further ado, we make the second introduction, please, David.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Lucia. And just adding on that and to the audience, so if you haven't visited the Ideas blog website, do that so you have a clear ideas of the breadth of the activities and events and ideas, so that, you know, basically like these guys are really flexible, and so, you know, no matter how crazy an idea you think you are, you think it is, you can contact them and see, like, you know, whether something can be worked out. And if you want to present something that is in the format of the Mind Sharpener, you can, you know, contact me directly. There is like a page, a Facebook page of the Mind Sharpener. But let's move on to today's event, finally. So I'm very happy to have with us for the second time, Laura. Laura presented a couple of years ago at a Mind Sharpener event about language acquisition. That was a more, I guess, general topic. Now she's, I guess, well, she's gonna go deeper in the specifics of her research, but at the same time keeping it accessible, I guess, to laymen, non-linguists. And a few words about Laura. I've known her for a few years now because she was doing with me like a PhD in Nottingham. So she's very smart, hardworking, and she's an international researcher working as you can find like in her, you know, in her bio, on vocabulary, psycholinguistics, and language acquisition. And so today she will be talking about how uncreative we are in using our language. So I'm happy to hand over the floor to Laura. And just one more thing to remind people, if you have questions, you know, my suggestion is to write them down in the chat so that they pile up. And then when it's kind of question, we can read them out loud, or then you can unmute your mics later on after Laura's talk. But now I would urge everybody, myself included, to silence our microphone so as to avoid any interference. And I happily hand over to Laura. Thank you, Laura, for accepting this invitation.
Thanks, Davide, for the presentation. And yes, it would be great if people who have questions could just write them down in the chat. I will start with my presentation straight away, I guess. Yes, just a second. Today I want to talk about my research, but I will be talking without any technical vocabulary, and I hope that everyone can follow really easily. What I'm doing generally, well, Davide has already introduced me a little bit. I work at Vilnius University, where I'm an assistant professor, and also I'm about to finish my postdoctoral fellowship. And today I would like to tell you about some of the main results from my postdoctoral research, and I will try to place them in more general context of language use and language learning as well. So we all grow up learning a language. We learn a language as babies and toddlers, and we later on use the language to find friends and to communicate with our friends. We move on, we go to school where language is the main tool of our learning. Then we need a language in workspace, and we need language to maintain our contacts with our friends. And essentially, we couldn't live our lives without speaking a language. We're all language usage professionals in a way. And throughout the lives, we actually accumulate a lot of linguistic experience. We accumulate a lot of language data, if you wish, through the language that we hear, the language that we read, the language that we speak ourselves. And to make things even more complicated, I can bet that every single one of you listening to this conversation are actually users of more than one language. Like, I'm speaking in English now, but you can very well guess that English is not my first language. And I could actually bet that English is probably not the first language for the most part of you. And still, we have also accumulated a lot of information about how English works. We have accumulated a lot of experience to English as well as our native tongue. So having a lot of this experience of reading, speaking, or writing in a language lets us have a very good knowledge about that language. We might not be able to voice that knowledge. We might not be able to tell the rules of how that language works. And actually, you probably have this feeling that the better you get with any language, the less you can explain it to other people. The more difficult it is for you to formulate the precise rules of why this thing works and the other thing doesn't work. But you have this knowledge, and you have a knowledge of the patterns in that language, and you have a knowledge of what is an acceptable phrase in that language and what isn't. And that could be called a native speaker intuition or a language user intuition. And I want to start my talk today from presenting you how this kind of native speaker intuition works. I hope I will be able to share with you, sorry, in just a second, one presentation. I will ask you to take your phone and join this website on menti.com with the code that you can see on the screen. And I will ask you to actually rate each one of these phrases on how grammatical you find they are. And by grammatical, I mean how well formed they are. Are they acceptable phrases in English? Would you say that, or would you hear that in a normal everyday English? So you would have to go online, probably with your phone would be the easiest option, and just rate each one of these phrases by entering. All right, I will give you a couple of minutes to do that. I hope you can join the Mentimeter. I will try it myself to make sure it works. Yeah, great. I can see the answers coming in already. Right, let's wait for another minute. Let's see how the scores are being adjusted with each additional answer. But you can hopefully also see that even if the scores get adjusted a little bit, there are no massive changes in the scores that people are giving to each of these sentences. So essentially, we all pretty much agree on which phrases are grammatical, on which phrases work in a language and which phrases sound natural. And it doesn't matter that we are not native speakers of English, we still have this knowledge. We can still feel which phrases are naturally occurring in English and which phrases will work. What we can also agree on very well is the question of which phrases certainly do not work. The phrases that you rated as the most ungrammatical were the following: do you walked tomorrow, or goes, likes, did, make. So we all agree that these are not potentially usable phrases in English. And again, we just have this intuition. Why did you make that decision? Well, obviously it was not based on words. There's nothing wrong with words in any of these phrases. The words are all fine. The problem is with grammatical structure. The problem is with the rules that some of the phrases do not follow. And traditionally, the language was seen as consisting of two types of things, of words and also of rules. So of lexis and of grammar. Sorry, just a second. For some reason, I cannot go to my slides. So I'll start again. Traditionally, the linguist would see language as consisting of two things, of the words and the grammar. So words and rules, lexis and grammar. And imagine if you had a large bag of marbles, and each one of these marbles would be separate words. You could choose any of the marbles you need and you want to communicate a message. And also, you would have a list of finite rules of how to put these marbles together to construct a message, how to arrange these marbles in such a way that you could communicate what you want to communicate. So you would take the marbles and you will fit the structure that you created using your rules, using your knowledge of the grammar rules. And this would allow you to communicate any potential message you want to. Using this kind of approach, in theory, you can list a finite set of rules, and that would be a limited set of rules. And you could use this finite set of rules to create unlimited number of sentences and to create and communicate unlimited number of ideas. So following this approach, the language is super creative. We build sentences from scratch every time we're using them, and the language can generate essentially an unlimited amount of sentences that you have never heard before, that you have never said before, and yet people listening to you would understand you. Sounds great, right? We're just amazingly creative human beings. And I'm not saying that the human linguistic ability is not amazing. It is truly fascinating. But what I'm saying, and what I will try to argue today, is that this approach of words plus rules is actually lacking and has a lot of problems. And people have noticed these problems for decades now. What are these problems? Well, first of all, as I have already briefly mentioned, we are not very good at voicing the rules, especially of our first language. We're not very good at explaining how the rules in language works. And when I say so, I actually think about my great-grandmother, whom I had a very big pleasure and joy to know rather well. And she was a fantastic woman, but she had a pretty difficult life. She lived through 2 world wars, and she had a lot of personal challenges in life. So she only managed to finish 4 years of the elementary school. She never got to any further education. So I'm pretty sure she couldn't have been able to explain to me that the genitive case in Lithuanian requires, that the negative sentences in Lithuanian require a genitive case. I'm actually pretty sure she would struggle with giving me examples of genitive case in Lithuanian in the first place. And yet she was perfectly capable in using negative sentences or using language in a lot of different contexts. And she's not some sort of extreme examples. If you tried to explain how your first language works to friends who are learning your language, you probably realized how difficult it is and how often we end up saying phrases like, oh, it just works like that. But okay, you could say the fact that we cannot verbalize the rules does not mean that those rules do not exist in our brain. Maybe they are just implicit. Maybe we know them without realizing that we know them. And I have to say it's a good argument. But there are other problems with this rules and words approach as well. Well, first of all, there are quite a lot of sentences in language that actually don't follow the rules, that break the rules. Like in the sentence that you see on the screen, we don't need no education. We have a double negative, which shouldn't work in English. It should be ungrammatical. It should be unacceptable. But people use language that way, and they are understood, and other people understand perfectly well what they want to say. And actually, depending on the context, depending on whom you are talking to, or how you want to present yourself, the use of these rules is actually pretty flexible, and there is a lot of variation in how we use language. So that's one thing. The other thing is that if you follow the rules very strictly, you actually have to approve sentences that sound weird, strange, unnatural. The sentences you see on the screen are technically grammatical. They have been used in psycholinguistic experiments. They are written by linguists because technically they don't violate any grammatical rules. But if you try to read them, sentences like the horse raced past the barn fell, the vampire, the ghost, the witch liked, loved, died, well, these are not sentences you would normally produce in the language. These are not sentences that the linguistic community expects you to produce. So again, you follow the rules, but it doesn't work that well, and it is a problem. And linguists started questioning this rules plus words approach, and they started seeing the problems with this approach very clearly with the introduction of language corpora and with the introduction of studies of language corpora in language studies. Before that, a lot of linguistic work was based on logical reasoning. Sometimes it's ironically even called armchair linguistics. So you sit down and you apply all the principles of the logical reasoning, and you rely on your own intuitions as a native speaker, or maybe you ask a couple of other people to tell them whether they think the sentence is acceptable or not, like I just asked you to do, where you simply said if you would accept that sentence. But essentially, you are making generalizations and you are making conclusions based on what you and some other people think about the language and based on the logic. And with technological advances, we were able to collect millions and billions of words of computer-readable language samples, and we became able to analyze this naturally occurring data. We became able to analyze a lot of instances of language being used by different people in different contexts, in writing and in spoken discourse. And this was a game changer. This is essentially allowed linguistics to become very much bottom up and to become very much based on real life language use and real life language data. And a couple of main findings emerged from corpus research, from early corpus research. Well, the first thing that became obvious is that grammar and lexis are not that easily distinguishable. It's not that easy to draw a line of where lexical knowledge finishes and grammatical knowledge starts. It turned out that certain constructions prefer certain words and not others. It turned out that not only words, but also constructions can carry meaning. It turned out that words tend to co-occur with certain words, and well, it's not that easy to classify all the linguistic system into words plus rules, lexis plus grammar. And one related and really astounding finding of corpus research was how widely used ready-made language is. How much we rely on the ready-made language when producing and when processing the language that we hear. And the technical term for ready-made language would be formulaic language. And formulaic language is actually an umbrella term. So it covers a lot of different terms, meaning a lot of different linguistical things. But what they all have in common is that we don't construct them from scratch each time we're using them. We have them memorized. We just know them. This doesn't mean we couldn't analyze them in terms of grammar. This doesn't mean we couldn't build them from scratch following the rules. But the thing is that we don't. We simply have them in the memory and we use them when we need them in our language production. And what you see here on the screen is a number of different types of formulaic sequences that we use in language. And I will show you a couple of examples, but I could give you many more examples if I had unlimited time for that. But let's start from collocations. So collocations are just usually two-word phrases, and these words just go together very frequently and they become mutually expected. So these are things like black coffee, exceptional circumstances, familiar face, take a picture, give somebody a break, give a chance, play a role, and so on. Then you can have compounds where technically each of these words is a two-word phrase, like coffee shop, living room, full moon, or real estate, but they kind of start to mean one single concept. So we are not adding two concepts and two words together. We have essentially one long word having its own particular meaning. One of the interesting types of formulaic sequences that's specifically important for English. In Lithuanian, we don't have that many of those, are lexical bundles. These are essentially larger chunks of language made of a couple of words, and they don't even have a specific meaning. Very often these are function words, these are grammatical words, but they are kind of fused together. We use them together so often that they become like building blocks of our language. So these are things like, or something like that, going to be, as a result of, and so on. Then we have idioms, and you're probably familiar with idioms. The main idea about idioms is that they have a figurative meaning. So you may know perfectly well what get means, and you may know what a room means, but it doesn't mean you would understand get a room if someone said it to you and you have never heard it before. So for idioms, the defining thing is their figurative meaning. And then technically, formulaic language is it's very diverse. Very different kinds of chunks of language fall into the category of formulaic language. So even if I do not speak Spanish, but even if I could cite you the text of Despacito, technically that's formulaic for me. I just know it by heart. I've learned it for some reason. And it doesn't really mean that I can construct it from scratch, or I could follow Spanish grammar to build all those phrases. No, I just have a memory of this song, of the lyrics of the song, and I can reproduce it from the memory. So as you can probably and hopefully already feel, formulaic language comes in different flavors, different sizes, different colors. It's just very diverse in nature. And those phrases are formulaic for different reasons. So I will not have time today to talk about all these different types of formulaic language that is out there, but I will focus on collocations. And most of my research is actually on collocations. But before I do so, I just want to ask you one more question today. I will ask you to try and guess how many formulaic sequences does an educated native speaker of English know? And I'm asking about the native speaker of English simply because there's much more research on English than on other languages. But think about an educated adult native speaker of English and try to place your best bet of how many formulaic sequences a person should know. Okay, we have one try.
Sorry, Laura, should we write our answers somewhere or just keep them in mind?
Can you see the menti.com on the screen? There's a question there.
I can't, but maybe it's my problem. I don't know if the others can.
Okay, I see people responding.
No, okay, so it's just my problem.
Not
No
in the screen. Maybe we were still in the Mentimeter, but I closed it. So maybe you can share the link again.
It's on the screen, I hope. It's menti.com and the code is on the screen.
No, we can see your PowerPoint.
Really? Okay,
yes.
I will try with that. Yeah, thanks.
The umbrella.
Yeah, we see.
Yeah, that's weird because, okay, sorry about that. I will try to share the screen again. Thanks for letting me know. Yeah. Is that all right now?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. Because I could see people voting, so I thought you can all see. Okay. What I like most about the results that I see is the spread of the answers. And essentially that spread is very suggestive. I'll wait for another moment. All right, so no one went for the billion of phrases, but apart from that, there's quite a spread on how many formulaic sequences do you think that we know? And well, the correct answer is no one really knows. How many specifically do we know? There have been educated guesses about it. There have been estimations. And one widely cited estimation by Powell and Sider, coming from 80s, suggests that an educated native speaker knows about hundreds of thousands of formulaic sequences. So those of you who said 100,000 are probably the closest to this estimate. However, the thing is that this estimate is pretty arbitrary. People cannot really count all the potential formulaic sequences out there But the take-home message is that there are a lot. And there are much more precise studies trying to estimate which parts of our text, which part of our language is covered by formulaic sequences. And some people actually suggest it's up to 80% of the language that is made up of formulaic sequences. More conservative approach, more conservative scholars suggest it's from 1/3 to 2/3 of our language that is made up of formulaic sequences, and the exact percent depends a lot on if we are speaking about spoken or written language and what kind of context we're speaking about. But in any case, it is a lot. And why do we use that much ready-made language? Why do we rely on formulaic sequences so much? Well, the easy answer is because it's convenient, because it's faster for us to produce, it's easier for us to understand, it's easier for our interlocutors to understand, so it makes the communication much smoother, it makes the communication function better, and that's why it's very convenient to use them. And if we think about collocations, so I will just keep an example of a collocation on the screen. Essentially, any word you can think of would have its own collocations. And if you looked in a large language corpus, and if you search for a collocation for any word you can think of, you would get tens or even hundreds of potential collocations. And these are just words that are used with that specific words. These are just words that are working really well with that specific word. These are with words that like each other's company, if you wish. And that's why the ability of knowing the collocations, the ability of knowing which words work really well together is usually seen as the highest level of achievement, of mastery, if we are speaking about learning a second language. Why? Because there's simply no way you can sit down and learn a list of hundreds of thousands of formulaic sequences. You just have to get this knowledge and these intuitions from the input you get, from listening to language, from exposing yourself to a lot of linguistic input, from reading a lot, from communicating a lot. So that's why language learners should be really interested and concerned with collocations. But why are collocations interested for linguists? Why do many linguists study collocations? Well, there are a couple of reasons why collocations are special and have a special status. First of all, a lot of studies now show that collocations are processed faster than relative control phrases. That is, if you hear a sentence with a collocation, it's easier for you to understand it. You are quicker at understanding it when compared to sentences with matched phrases that do not contain collocations. And obviously, language processing happens very quickly. So when I say faster, I'm talking milliseconds. I'm talking tens of milliseconds. But in any case, there's this clear processing facilitation for formulaic sequences when compared to novel phrases. We also have an advantage in producing them. We seem to be much more fluent when producing formulaic sequences rather than producing novel phrases. Also, collocations are simply expected. Our interlocutors expect us to use language in such a way and not the other. And this slide gives you examples from a brilliant experiment of Miller, where he took word sequences from writings of non-native speakers, of language learners, and technically those word sequences could exist, things like best partner or cheap cost, but in English, produced by native speakers community, they don't, because they say ideal partner or low cost. And what Miller showed is that if we produce these sequences that could exist, but they are not collocational, they slow down, they hinder communication, and it's counterproductive. So collocations are simply words that work together really well. And they are words that we know that go well together. They are words we rely on when producing our linguistic messages. And because they are so common, because there are so many of them, because they are used so often, and because they are a preferred way of communicating messages, well, the question arises of how do we store this information about the collocations? How do we memorize them? How do we have this information available to us? Well, one thing that we can be pretty sure about, that it's not part of grammatical knowledge, right? So it must be part of our lexical knowledge. It must be a part of our mental lexicon. We must somehow save those word sequences to the mental lexicon that we have in our brain. Well, remember the marbles. So if single words are small marbles, you could think of collocations as big words, just bigger marbles. Why couldn't the lexicon consist of units of different sizes? And actually, this metaphor of big words is very often used in linguistics when explaining experimental data of collocation processing, or when defining collocations and talking about formulaic sequences in general. But probably a better metaphor than marbles would be Lego bricks. Imagine you had a huge number of Lego bricks as your mental lexicon, and you could take those bricks and build a Lego house, and this Lego house would be a message that you want to communicate. Now, you could technically use only the smallest pieces of the Lego bricks. You could technically build only from the smallest ones, but that would be very ineffective and that would take very long, and probably your house would crumble. So it's much faster and much more efficient to just take larger chunks that you have and add them together and get your house ready much quicker and get your house much more stable. And this seems to be working pretty well, but this metaphor and this whole idea of collocation as a big word has one big limitation. Well, it kind of assumes that this collocation is fixed and frozen, and it's like a brick, it's like a unit. But if you start looking at the naturally occurring data, again, if you take a corpus and you look for examples of collocations, very quickly you notice that they are far from being fixed, that the form is very flexible, that you can have other words intervening between the elements of collocation. I can learn language, learn a new language. You can swap the elements around. You can say learned language, language learned. You can also change the morphological form of the collocation. You can say learn language, learned language, language learning. And the question remains, what happens in all these cases? Are these all still collocations? Do we still process them faster? Or do we kind of break that unit, that large word, once we modify them, and we're down to words and rules and creating language from scratch? And this is the question that has bothered me since I started working with collocations. The question of how we can modify them, and do they still retain all of the features of the collocation, being processed faster, being understood faster, once we modify them? And to answer this question, I carried out a couple of psycholinguistic experiments, and I will briefly present 3 of them to you today. And I tried to answer specifically these questions of what happens if we change the form of the collocation. So first of all, I looked at processing non-adjacent collocations. So I gave my participants sentences to read, and these sentences contained either a collocation or a collocation with other words intervening. And I had their eye movements recorded while they were reading sentences. And when we record eye movements of people while reading, we can actually get a very precise measure of how long it takes for them to process certain words we're interested in. And because the only task they are performing is to read text, to read a sentence, they don't really alter their behavior. They don't make any decisions. They just read. And this reading behavior is very informative in terms of language processing. So what I had my participants read sentences with either collocations, like provide information, or control phrases, like compare information. And then I also had these sentences modified, like John was asked to provide some of the information or to compare some of the information. So essentially, I was able to compare the processing time of a collocation to a processing time of a control phrase, both when the collocates directly follow each other and when there are words intervening between them. And what I found was that we can insert up to 3 other words in between the collocates, and the collocation still remains formulaic. We still are able to use our knowledge of these 2 words being mutually expected, and we still process the word language faster in this context because we are still expecting it from processing the word learn. So my next question was, what happens if we swap the collocations apart? Here I had a different methodology. I had a primed lexical decision task. So essentially, what my participants saw was first a fixation cross on the screen, followed by the first word in the collocation, blank screen, and then a second word. And they had to make the decision whether the second word was a real word in English or not. Now, this would happen really quickly. They would see the first word for only 250 milliseconds, and then they would have to make their decision as quickly and as accurately as possible to the second word. But essentially, this allows me to see the connection between the first word and the second word, and how expected the second word is, given the first word, for the participants. And what I found in this study was that people are expecting the collocation forwards as well as they are expecting the collocation backwards. So essentially, the word order doesn't matter. These 2 words are connected either way. Whether you see learned language or language learned, it's the same thing. And my final question was, what happens if we change the morphological form of the collocation? So again, I had an eye tracking study. I recorded eye movements of my participants while they were reading short stories. And in those stories, they had collocations and control phrases, again, in Lithuanian. So you have Lithuanian examples and English translations here. And they had each of these collocations in 3 different morphological forms. So essentially, I could compare the processing facilitation for collocations for the past tense third person, for the infinitive form, and also for the participle form. And in each of these 3 grammatical forms, I could see very clearly if the collocation is understood faster than non-collocation. And essentially what I found is that you can change the morphological form of the collocation and the phrase remains a collocation. It is still processed faster. It's still understood faster. So essentially, bringing all 3 experiments together, what we can see is that collocations seem to be really flexible. You can add words in between their elements. You can swap the elements around. You can change the grammatical form of the collocation. And in all these 3 cases, they still remain formulaic. They still remain ready-made. We still expect them to occur. So essentially, this means that this whole theoretical explanation of collocation being a large unit in the mental lexicon, of the collocation being fixed and frozen, the collocation being a level brick, crumbles. And it actually fails to explain why we process collocations faster. So a better explanation, a better metaphor could be imagining collocations and language system in general as a sort of network, a network of words where the words are connected to each other based on different reasons. Some words are connected between themselves because they are semantically similar. Some words are connected because they have similar phonetical form. Some words are connected because of their collocational associations, because they are used very often in the language and they are used together. And these connections between the words are learned implicitly. We do not sit down and we do not study them, and we do not deliberately learn which words work well together. We kind of accumulate this network of knowledge through years and years of experience with language, the language you've heard, the language you've read, the language you speak yourself. And as members of the same language community, like we're all members of English-speaking community, we share a lot of this information. Our networks are very similar, simply because we are exposed to similar kinds of input. We are exposed to similar language and we form similar connections. And this allows us to communicate really smoothly, and this allows us to communicate really well, because what research shows us, when we listen to the language or when we read the language, we are not really passive recipients. We're actively engaged in predicting what's coming up next. And these collocational associations allow us to be really good at predicting what's coming up next and what we should expect. And this makes language processing faster and easier. So essentially, language is nothing similar to just filling a grammatical structure with individual words. It's we say words because the words attract each other. We say words because the words are connected to each other. And we're very much influenced by the knowledge of our linguistic network when making choices about which words to use and when. So essentially, instead of creating language, we are recreating the phrases that we've used before, that other people used before, that we have heard or read so many times. And when saying that, I'm not talking about the content. The content is a different story and it's a different discussion. I'm talking about the linguistic form. So we're recreating the linguistic form. We are recreating the ready-made language that we have ready for us. And this is the case not only for collocation. This is the case for idioms and phrasal verbs and sayings and lexical bundles and clichés and songs. And for various reasons, because of their various features, they all tend to be formulaic. We have them all memorized and available to us. But essentially, we are not creating them each time we're using them. We're just recreating them from memory, and we are using them for our purposes. Now, some people don't like this idea. Some people, even linguists, say that's a bad use of language. That's not creative. That's relying on cliches. That essentially just shows that we're not capable of using the language anymore. And usually the argument they give you is, think about literature, think about fiction, think about novels. Now that's a proper use of language. And once they mention fiction, I know they completely missed the point about formulaic language. When writing a novel, you surely want to be creative. You want an inspiring and unpredictable plot. You want a storyline that captures your reader. You maybe want some unexpected metaphors or new comparisons. But you also want to be readable. You also want to be understood. You don't want to be unintelligible. And you want your text to be easy to follow. So it is just inevitable that writers use a lot of formulaic language. There are even studies showing that in certain genres, writers use more formulaic language that we actually use in our everyday conversations. Otherwise, they would simply be unintelligible. And unless you're writing some futuristic experimental poetry, it's rarely your aim to be unintelligible. So formulaic language is just the way the language works. In some cases, the language works in such a way because of the way the world works. Like we say dark night because nights tend to be dark. In other cases, there is no apparent reason why these two words work together. We're just used to hearing them together because of our linguistic exposure. But in any case, we're drawing on our linguistic experience, and we're using this experience to be fluent in language and to be understood easily by the people we're talking to. You drink your coffee black and not gray. You see a familiar face and not a known face. You take a picture, but you don't make a picture. You give a chance, but you don't suggest a chance. You could, but it's simply not a linguistic convention. And this is simply how the language works. And you order fast food, but not quick food. And instead of seeing it as some sort of a limitation or our inability to use a language, we should see as an indication of the fantastic ability of human beings. We're capable of storing a lot of linguistic information. We're capable of finding patterns in the linguistic input that we accumulate throughout our lives. We're capable of reusing these patterns to become the best kind of communicators that we possibly can. And we are essentially creating this universe of connections between words in our minds. And I personally find it really fascinating. It is a fantastic ability that we have, and we should appreciate it and be absolutely happy with using formulaic language because it simply helps us to communicate better. Thank you very much. And I will open the chat to see if there are any questions. And if you are thinking of any questions now, feel free to ask them.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, for a really interesting and accessible, but also like intriguing talk, also like sharing the results of your experiments. Now I know why I should write more formulaic poetry, why people complain.
Yeah, that's why people find poetry difficult,
yes,
right?
Yes, but but you're right, like there is a big stigma in literary criticism, and even let's say in myself or whatever, like we are really spotting like, these two words usually go together, why did you write them? So I think there is kind of a censor inside many writers that prevent them to, or especially maybe in poetry, but maybe in some forms, especially preventing them to write, using formulaic language. But actually, when even reading novel by important authors, and you realize that in a novel, you realize that there is a lot of, recurring patterns and formulaic language. So, like as you say, like helps the flow of the narration and help the writer being understood.
Yeah, I think I see you write this question, but I just want to react to your comment. I think very often when people say, formulaic language is kind of uncreative or a bad way to use a language, they are thinking very narrowly about formulaic language, just about as if it was just clichés, as if it was just, some sort of reused, overused patterns or sayings or things like that. But if you start thinking collocations or phrasal verbs or lexical bundles, they are essentially inevitable in your language. And I think you start to appreciate that very well when you start learning a foreign language where you don't feel these associations and where you feel that you know, anything works, grammatically it's correct, and yet then you say things to your friends or to your teachers, and they keep correcting you, just giving a reason that, you know, that's not how we say things.
Yeah.
And I think there's a huge difference between something being written in clichés and something being written in fluent language. And formulaic language very often translates into the language being fluent.
Very good point.
Yeah,
I'll let you
for the question.
out the question.
I'm personally mostly working with the usage-based approach, usage-based grammar, usage-based language acquisition, which essentially emphasizes the importance of frequency of occurrence and frequency of co-occurrence. So a lot of data from corpora and things like that. But construction grammar would actually be not, well, would be one of the approaches people in the field are taking. So they are kind of, construction grammar would be very much, would follow the ideas of usage-based approach as well, because as you are probably well aware, it again, it looks at the data, it looks at the connection between the words and the structures, grammatical structures, and the meaning that the structures carry. But yeah, but me, myself, I'm working with usage-based grammar mostly. Writing systems, how about Korean, Chinese, or Arabic? That is a good question, and I'm not a great person to answer that, but I will try. The same patterns for sure, and now there are a lot of studies on formulaic language in Chinese. Now there are a lot of studies looking at formulaicity in reading Chinese, and I'm sure there are more studies coming up in the near future. Essentially, the problem with many fields and many questions in psycholinguistics or in applied linguistics is that the majority of our knowledge is actually based on studies with English. It's simply traditionally, a lot of universities are in English-speaking countries, universities where these fields are very active. And I find this is a problem, and that's why I'm really happy that at least two of the studies I was presenting to you today, I was presenting in English, but they were actually carried out in Lithuanian and with Lithuanian data, with Lithuanian stimuli. And I actually see it as an advantage, because I think the fact that we can replicate the same findings, we find the same things like collocations being processed faster, makes these findings much more robust and makes them much more applicable to the language in general, rather than to English language or some other specific language. If uncommon construction suppress the reader and make them respond in time, could it be that this deliberate technique? Okay, that's a good question. Could slowing down communication actually be a good thing? Well, yes and no. Depends on how much, I guess. If it's no, I don't know, one or two uncommon metaphors that you used in your writing, and the reader was reading and went like, "Oh, that's something I've never thought about," that may be, as you say, breaking up the monotony, and maybe it's a good idea. But if your writing is non-formulaic at all, this means your writing is actually, it takes longer to process, but not in a positive sense. Essentially, a person would be allocating quite a lot of mental abilities to just understand the language, to understand what you are saying, instead of having these abilities to process the content, to focus on the content. And also, I think it would be really tiring to read a language that is completely non-formulaic or mostly non-formulaic. Now, again, I think the issue is that when we are speaking in our first language, especially, we don't realize how formulaic it is. We sometimes struggle to give examples of collocations or to give examples of lexical bundles because we don't notice them. We don't think about them. They just come really natural to us. And there are two ways when we become to notice it very clearly. Well, one situation is very specific to people in linguistics. When you sit down and you try to write a phrase that is not collocation and still is acceptable phrase with that word, you really struggle because words don't come to your mind. And I know it very well because I had to write non-collocations for many experiments that I conducted. Essentially, you think of a word, you think, okay, that's great, that's going to be a great control phrase. And then you realize that is a collocation. You just never thought about it that way. Because of the way the linguistic system is structured, if you think of the word, its collocates get activated and they are easily accessible. You start thinking about them instead of thinking about other potential words. So that's one situation. And another situation where I think most of us have been, and I've already mentioned it briefly before, is when you are speaking a language that is not your L1, when it's not your mother tongue, and you just don't know which words work well together, especially at the beginning stages. And coming back to creating literature in that other language, well, I have one experience myself when during my Erasmus studies, I was brave enough to attend a creative writing course in Italy. Well, I was studying Italian, so it's not as random as it sounds now. But essentially, that's what I thought, you know, I'm bringing my own linguistic experience with other languages, and my writing will simply be more creative. And believe me, it wasn't appreciated, partially because it was not like certain things, they are not creative, they are just non-fluent, and creativity comes from different aspects, from different decisions than fluency. Okay, and we have the last question of Veronica. Thank you. Eye tracking experiments. I was wondering if you have done any priming experiments, could they be informative? How connected is your network? Unit lose significance. Yeah, so a couple of questions from Veronica. I will start from answering the question about priming experiments. Yeah, as I said, two of the experiments I briefly talked about today were eye tracking experiments, but one of them was actually priming experiment, and it was a primed lexical decision task. So yeah, priming experiments are very informative in terms of understanding mental lexicon and connections between words. And yeah, I do see a lexicon as a network. I do see the lexicon as a connectionist network, essentially. And your last question, if so, doesn't the idea of the big words lose its significance? Absolutely. That's essentially what I'm trying to communicate, that we cannot see formulaic sequences as big words. We cannot see them as large holistic chunks. We have to see them as some sort of associations, and very strong associations between linguistic units, where one word simply activates the other, and that's why it becomes easier to process. So, so essentially, the network idea can explain the existence of formulaic sequence equally well as can big words approach, I think. And I think the experimental data clearly points that direction. That's a good question. Pavlos is asking, how do I choose phrases for my experiments? if I say that actually everything that comes to my mind is most likely the collocation, how do you make sure it is not? As I already said in my talk, nowadays no one is doing the armchair linguistics anymore. So we don't rely on our intuitions. We don't assume that we know perfectly well how language works. We test our intuitions. So there are very specific definitions of what counts as a collocation in terms of frequency of using those words together, and in terms of some statistical measures of mutual expectancy between those words, such as mutual information score or various other tests that have been suggested. So essentially, when choosing what is a collocation and what is not for my studies, for any other studies, for any other reason, we usually consult the corpus data and we look at just loads of accumulated linguistic experience of what people use together and what they don't, what is typically used together and what is rarely used together. So there are very clear cut criteria for that. I just didn't go into the detail today for some mental diseases. Yeah, practical findings of the practical applications of these findings are twofold, I would say. But if I'm very honest, these 3 experiments that I was talking about are mostly interesting in terms of theoretical models, in terms of understanding how the mental lexicon works. However, once we do understand how the mental lexicon works, we can be better at teaching. We can make sure we introduce things like collocations and other formulaic sequences in the teaching syllabi much more systematically, and it's being already done. And also knowing better about how language works obviously helps the clinical linguistics as well. But there's a huge leap between finding out which theoretical explanation of collocations in the mental lexicon works best and applying that in practice for actual diagnosis. All right, I see David switching off his camera and yeah.
I have a question myself also.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm lazy to write, I'm sorry. Is there, in your research, did you find, or maybe it included some sort of equivalence between these formulaic sequences and, say, for example, intonations or inflections of the voice? As in, also, you mentioned that the structure also conveys meaning, so maybe also these forms of the voice that are maybe ready-made forms that convey meaning, also related to this kind of collocations, or
could you give an example of what you mean? I'm not sure.
For example, let's say that to express the same emotion, there are some given inflections of the voice that might be more universal than we believe to be, similar to this connection of concept of the sequence.
I think that's a very interesting idea. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer because I'm mostly working with written language. So I'm mostly working with reading. Then the intonation kind of is not in the picture anymore, right? But I guess you are absolutely right that it could play a role. And there are studies about formulaic language in listening or in production when speaking, and they simply show that we are more fluent in producing them. We hesitate less. We have them again readily available. But I'm not aware on anything in terms of intonation and voice and meaning. There could be, as I said, I'm mostly working with written language, so I guess I could just have missed it as well. All right, I guess we will finish here, but I'm actually surprised in a good way how many questions I received. So thanks very much for questions.
One second, I have one short question more.
Sure.
It's not serious of no, but shouldn't we, foreign learners of Lithuanian, try to learn as many man atrodo kad sort of sequences as possible?
Absolutely, and there are my colleagues working on that, and we actually have made all the list of academic formulaic sequences in Lithuanian now.
Okay,
So
I want that. I could kill for that. So okay, because yeah, rather than calculating all the time the endings, I think that may, I don't know whether it's the to what extent like the grammar enters the picture, but maybe it's easier to remember ne and o of the genitive rather than calculating all the time, which is very tiring.
yeah, it's essentially all about getting a lot of experience to extract patterns and to generalize those patterns to your language use.
Okay. So thank you, Laura. It has been a great presentation, and thank you to the public for your questions, very interesting technical questions sometimes that allow Laura to expand even more on her points. So thanks again to everybody. And there will be some more mind sharpeners in the future, but follow the page and we'll know about it. Okay. So
all right.
bye everyone. Thanks for joining. Bye.